Hi, how are you today? We're going to look at, in this podcast, Chapter 4, which is the first of the principles which support the book. It is a scientific approach to strategic management. I should point out that there's quite a lot of material in this chapter, so the podcast won't cover every item, and you'll probably need to read the chapter to get the detail. First thing I want to say is that there are some jobs which demand high levels of relevant experience. You know, things like a minimum of 5 years experience is required and so on. Now, imagine if we had 10 managers in a room and we were able somehow or another to wire up their brains, and each of the managers had 10 years of experience. We would then have at our disposal 100 years of experience with which to solve management problems. Now, just imagine if it were possible to have 12,000 years of experience on which to draw when we're attempting to solve managerial problems. Well, that's what this scientific research is based on. It's called the PIMS Studies, where PIMS stands for the Profit Impact of Market Strategy. And in this, one of the largest strategic databases ever created, there are 3,000 businesses, and there's 4 years data on each business, giving a total of 12,000 years of experience. And each business provides 100 data points. This study, which originally started with General Electric but then expanded to take in other companies, sought to explore the relationship between market share and return on capital employed, and then it was expanded somewhat to include all the factors that seem to determine return on capital employed. In terms of the industries represented in the database, we can see that it's fairly comprehensive, and you ought to be able to see if your own industry is represented there. And in terms, this slide shows rather well actually the average return on capital employed of firms in the database. And as you can see, they're divided starkly into two types: those that have an above average return on capital employed and those that have a below average return on capital employed. We're principally interested in those that have an above average return on capital employed. The reason we're interested in them is to learn from them. This schematic diagram shows how PIMS operates, and how it operates is it takes data from the members, then enters the data into a database, and we are actually really only interested in the left hand side of that slide. PIMS research activities have enunciated or allowed them to develop the general principles of strategy, and they have been further developed into the strategy compass. PIMS has a number of general objectives, which are to maintain a database, to refine the laws of the database, to apply the research to participating businesses. But what's much more interesting, I think, for myself, are the specific objectives of PIMS. And these are, for my business, what would be the normal return on capital employed for any business structured the way mine is? What are the major factors determining return on capital employed? The business structure that I happen to have, does it permanently preclude having a high return on capital employed? Do we need to change it to boost our return on capital employed? What strategies do we need to achieve our objectives, and are our strategic objectives in conflict? PIMS has a number of very interesting concepts, and in this podcast I want to look at two. And the first is the strategic peer. You know, the normal or the traditional way to compare two firms is to take two firms in a particular industry and compare their performances. You know, for example, if you wanted to assess a clothing firm, to assess it in relation to other clothing firms. If you wanted to assess a furniture firm's performance, to assess it in relation to other furniture firms. But PIMS has a unique and I think very attractive way to look at firms. For example, if we wish to compare two clothing manufacturers, Here could be the first one. It has its own supplies, its own operations, its own marketing, its own distribution, and it sells its output to an independent or independent retailers. That sort of firm is a major firm. It's an integrated clothing manufacturer. You may also have a clothing manufacturer structured like this. We can call this a captive clothing manufacturer, where all it does is operations, and it makes all its products to conform to designs determined by a retailer, for example, a large multiple. What PIMS would assert would be that you will learn more about a captive clothing manufacturer by comparing it with a captive furniture manufacturer, rather than comparing it with an integrated clothing manufacturer. And that is the concept of the strategic peer. That it's better to compare captives than it is to compare by industry label. The concept of the strategic peer. Second concept borrows heavily, I'm glad to say, on the world of golf. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, here's a brief introduction to the scoring system in golf. Every golfer has a handicap. Let's say it's 18. And if you play to your handicap, it is said you've played to your par. But that doesn't mean that every time an 18 handicap golfer goes out, he or she will score exactly to their handicap. Some days they'll play very badly and their actual score will be way above par. Some days they'll play very well and their actual score will be below par. So they really have two sorts of scores going all the time. Their par, which is their handicap, and their actual. Now PIMS says that we can apply this to firms. And if instead of talking about handicap, we talk about return on capital employed. For all businesses, there is, as shown by the red line, what we could call a par return on capital employed. That is the expected ROCE which a firm structured like that ought to have. But that doesn't mean that it will perpetually achieve that return on capital employed. What's more likely is that sometimes, maybe for a few years or so, it will do better than its par, and then slowly over time it will sink to below par and then rise up again. So all firms have two returns on capital employed: their par return on capital employed and their actual return on capital employed. This is done very briefly and I will return to it in group. PIMS studies have found that there are 9 basic findings which apply to all businesses. There they are on the screen. I really don't have time in this podcast to go through them. You can read up on them in the book. And in addition to that, they have found that there are 9 major influences on profitability and cash flow. Once again, I'm not going to go through these at all on this podcast. I'm just going to tell you we will return to them and look at them in greater detail in the next podcast. It just remains for me to acknowledge the hardware, the software and the music, which as usual is almost exclusively from Apple. And it's time for me to say goodbye to you and to thank you for listening, to hope that you enjoyed the podcast and to hope that you will listen to some more on the future. Thank you very much for listening and goodbye.